The story of the 10-year-old Ohio rape victim was supposed to be this big gotcha moment for the left, to justify their hysteria over Roe v. Wade, to justify their protests, to justify their outrage and their violence and their threats, and to be able to point fingers at the extremist pro-life movement with an explicit example of apparently how harmful it is to women and girls to limit abortion access, and that supposedly the right are just heartless monsters because we would force a 10-year-old victim of rape to carry a baby to term, which is not true. But this story backfired on them, and it backfired in a big way. I mean, of course, they don't have even a sliver of self-awareness. It'll never occur to them their utter soullessness that was exposed in this entire situation. But that's fine, because we can point it out. First, we are talking about a 10-year-old girl that was raped. This girl is probably in 4th grade. She was living in a dangerous situation, being horrifically abused, living an absolute nightmare, yet the adults around her said nothing. And anyone that could or should have been helping, like, I don't know, her doctors, the police, her mom, they did nothing. At least not until the situation escalated to a point that might expose her abuser. Well, why would exposing her abuser be an issue? Isn't that what we're supposed to do, especially for 10-year-old victims of rape? Wouldn't that be the first problem to address? Apparently not. Instead of the people around her keeping her safe, the story went under the radar. That is, until it served a purpose. And that purpose was Roe v. Wade. When she needed protection, she got the Washington Post. When she needed to be removed from a harmful environment, the only relief she got in that way was when she was unnecessarily driven out of state for an abortion. And nobody seems to be able to answer the question as to why. Was it to hide the fact her abuser was an illegal immigrant, or to protect him from deportation? Was it solely to create a crisis that strict abortion laws would cause more children to have to be driven out of state for abortions? Does anyone else see the problem here? That the primary issue isn't abortion access for abused children, but the sexual abuse of children in the first place. I mean, or the sexual abuse of anyone, for that matter. Was there even an ounce of thought to the horror this girl had been living when the Washington Post and the rest of the mainstream media decided to use this story to push their hysteria over Roe v. Wade? Were the outraged Elizabeth Warren or Amy Klobuchar going to finally put an end to her nightmare? Nope. Not one of the leftist media, pro-abortion activists, or so-called journalists talked about her as a child facing the horror of rape, facing the horror of living with her abuser, or facing the horror of no one protecting her from it. They were only talking about the horror of whether or not she could get an abortion. And the icing on the cake for them was that they could use and exploit her terrifying situation to paint their political enemies as the monsters. Because according to the people on the left, apparently people on the right are worse than child rapists. No one on the left wanted to talk about the dangers of illegal immigration, or the fact that the city of Columbus passed an ordinance 5 years ago that instructs police to let federal immigration authorities handle immigration enforcement, which means it's not being handled at all, and that Columbus city officials have stated pretty much the more the merrier when it comes to illegal immigrants. This is far from an isolated incident. I mean, who knows how many countless victims there are because of these policies. Women and children are being victimized and abused on a daily basis, and their abusers know they won't be reported because the family of their victim don't want to be deported. Yet no one hyperventilating about the abortion actually wants to talk about the victims. No one wanted to talk about increasing punishments against people who victimize children in this way, to take greater steps in an effort to keep it from happening at all, and definitely don't want to talk about closing the borders. The only focus was whether or not this little girl could end the life in her womb, and that's it. Not to mention the lies that were spread and the lack of interest in the facts at hand. The fact that she never needed to go to Indiana to get the abortion, because as confirmed by the Ohio Attorney General, she would have been able to receive an abortion in her home state, because in Ohio law, a physician can make the call if they believe a pregnancy is a threat to the physical health of the pregnant woman. And we can all agree that a 10-year-old carrying a baby to term, that would put her at great risk. And you can say, oh, the pro-life movement, they're just backtracking, they've never believed in that. that we're just, going back on what we said to look better. But the fact is, an endangered and abused 10-year-old falls under the category safe, legal, and rare, which is the standard that set the goalposts years ago that we pretty much all agreed upon across the board. But those are the goalposts that the left has taken upon themselves to move to be more and more extreme. And what about the fact that the Columbus police repeatedly stated that no report involving a 10-year-old rape victim had been filed, only to make an arrest the next day? Why? Because they looked bad if they didn't make an arrest now that the story was public? And now this child's own mom is trying to say that the girl is fine and that it was all a lie. Why? Is she wanting to hide the abuse so she doesn't get deported herself? So now the abuse of her daughter is going to be hidden because she's too afraid of what's going to happen. We still don't know. What we do know is that there is a terrified, traumatized little girl in the middle of all of this who deserves to be safe. And there's not one pro-abortion activist, leftist official, or spokesperson for the White House who wants to talk about her safety and the reasons that she was put in danger. So like I said, the left, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Elizabeth Warren, AOC, all of them salivated over this girl's trauma so they could exploit her story for their political narrative and could barely contain their glee at making the opposing political party look like monsters. But what they ended up doing was confirm how little they actually care about rape victims, especially with how many times they cite their cases for their political narrative. And that they really only want to acknowledge that kind of horror and trauma if there's a baby's life that needs to be ended. They're totally devoid of any limiting principles that would force them to draw a line as to how far they'd go for a narrative. And totally to let this kind of thing happen to thousands of other women and girls by not addressing the dangers of open borders and sanctuary cities. And that they ignore these things. And their total disinterest in the thousands of other victims of these circumstances that play out every single day, because it only matters if that trauma serves a purpose, like abortion. It's absolutely despicable. The exploitation of abuse, the neglect of victims, no interest in preventing it, and the greatest threat to victims of rape and sexual assault is abortion access, not the fact that they were victimized in the first place. But one thing we can say, if the media and these activists hadn't been as horrendous at their job as they are, and the horrendous kind of human beings that they are, practically putting the story out there and begging to be found out, this story wouldn't have caught the attention of real journalists. And this little girl might still be in the hands of her abuser. If they hadn't been so excited about a story that they could use to pin and paint their political enemies as horrible people, as monsters, as people who don't care, and use it to hopefully correct the path of self-destruction that they're headed for in the upcoming elections, we might not have been able to uncover the facts of this story and how heinous it really is, and hopefully find other victims that we can help. So thank you for just one more blatant demonstration of your true depravity, your utter soullessness, and your lack of limits. Keep up the great work.